Thank you very much, and thank you all for staying on with such great weather as we're enjoying. Anyway, I'm going to be talking about Cowboys, Bushrangers, and Gauchos, the global settler mode of cinema. We are used to considering the Western as a really American genre, focusing on American history and myths. And here you have a couple of quotations. One by André Bazin, who said that the Western is the American film par excellence, and then another one by Philip French, who said that one of the things the Western is always about is America rewriting and reinterpreting her own past. But we all, or most of us, already know how global the Western is. Okay, and here we have. I think that most of you are already familiar with these books or others that have explored the global dimension of the West. And there you have a couple of quotations. One by Neil Campbell, who said that the West is always already transnational. Another one by Susan Collin, who said that the Western sensibilities have been shaped by a larger history of imperialism. And we could add one by Marek, who talked about the Western as a genre with a colonial past and a post-colonial significance. So today I'm going to focus on the parallels and differences between different versions of the West that have appeared all over the world, focusing in particular in Australia and Argentina. But before we start looking at them, I would like to mention Mayer and Roche, in their analysis of the global Western film, in this fine book. They establish a difference between two types of Westerns made outside the United States. They talk about Westerns fictionally set in the American West, like spaghetti Westerns or other European Westerns, where the action basically takes place in the American West, even though one can find allegorical meanings in some of these films about other places. But then we find Westerns that are fictionally set in other locations and periods that resemble the American West in different ways. And here they establish a difference between Westerns that are made in countries with a similar settler colonial history and a similar film history to that of the US, like Argentina, Australia, and other former European colonies like Brazil and New Zealand, and then Westerns made in other countries. Okay, and here we could include Soviet Westerns, Korean Westerns set in Manchuria, or Spanish films like 100 Bullets, Irish films like Into the West, or French films like Le Cowboy, which are set in Spain, in Ireland, or in France, in countries whose history is very much unrelated to that of those other countries with a similar, with settler colonial history. So today we're going to focus on this group of, well, a couple of countries, okay, that are these, where we can find films that are made in countries with a similar settler colonial history. And I want to start with a couple of definitions by two Australian scholars, Peter Limbrick and Peter Rout, who talk about a settler colonial mode of cinema, which would include American Westerns, but then also Australian Westerns and or Argentinian, I would add, films. Okay, so Peter Rout, okay, he talks about American Westerns and Australian bushranger films. This would be the Australian equivalent to Westerns, which are the result of similar historical situations or cultural coincidences, he says. And then he says that the American Western is not the American cinema par excellence, but the epitome of a global cinema. Okay? And then Peter Limbrick says that both types of films were a similar settler colonial response to the experience of colonizing and settling as home an environment inhabited by Aboriginal people, with the result of, and this is where he uses this expression, a settler colonial mode of cinema, which is characterized by similar narrative themes. Okay, so we find the similar history, similar culture, so the themes are also similar. Settler families working the land, male outlaws, white indigenous relations, and as a result, similar modes of representation. So you make films where this is shown with extreme long shots of landscape, or visual contrast between empty landscape and lone individuals on horseback or settled farms. So let's look at this, the Australian case in more detail. The Western in Australia, when scholars about the Australian Western talk about this, they always talk about these bushranger films that were produced between 1904 and 1913. These films were made independently from American Westerns. Okay, so this is the important thing. Again, and they were shot in outdoor settings. Of course, the unique Australian landscape, and they focused on irreverent anti-heroes who have become stereotypes of the Australian character. This is not the only country where one can find bandit films. You know, Hobsbawm wrote about social bandits, but there seems to be a reason why they have been so popular in Australia. Most of these films deal with one bushranger called Ned Kelly, who has become a sort of hero and representative of American character. And what Lewis says is that this has to do with Australian convict past. Okay, the fact that they all came from this convict situation has created a national predilection to favor the underdog. Okay, this is what he says. And so much so that Ned Kelly has become a fighter for freedom and a precursor for Australian national independence, even though he was a bandit and a murderer. Okay. Anyway, it's also interesting to mention the fact that the first long film in history was one of these bushranger films. It was made in 1906, and it's 60-minute long. But anyway, they ended up being banned in 1913 because the Australian authorities did not like the way the image that they were portraying, okay, about Australians, okay, and they only came back later on in 1970s, and there have been several Ned Kelly films, okay, later on, one of them with Mick Jagger as Ned Kelly, and several others, okay. Australians are obsessed with Ned Kelly, okay. Anyway, after this period of bushranger films, they were banned, and therefore American films and American Westerns in particular took the chance to dominate or to take the market. Okay, so in 1927, 95% of the films shown in Australia were produced in the USA. So as a result, what happened is that this sort of Australian brand of the Western more or less disappeared. Okay, and it became so influenced by American Westerns that what you can find are actually hybrid Australian Westerns, okay, which have been called Kangaroo Westerns, okay. Yeah, not very originally. Yeah, you know, they keep on using this kind of terms all the time. Anyway, these films that started being made already in the 20s, and then they were more in the 40s and 50s, like the Kangaroo Kid or Kangaroo, the Australian Story. They combine American iconography and themes with Australian settings and characters. And Cook has said, oops, this keeps on moving. Yeah. Cook has said that, in fact, what happens is that there is no mature or classic phase. Okay, so it's, I mean, if you compare the evolution of the Australian Western to the American Western, there's nothing like, you know, the Australian West, the American Westerns of the 40s and 50s that develop a discourse about American identity. And what he says is that there is no independent discourse about Australian identity because of this American domination. Okay, so in fact, one has to wait until the 21st century, and this is where you find Australian films that deal with Australian identity using conventions and stereotypes coming from the Western. Okay, and these are, for example, The Tracker and The Proposition. The Proposition, for example, is set, this is the film that we're going to watch later on, and in the film that Amaya mentioned before. So this is set in 1880s colonial Australia, and it tells the story of a violent confrontation between the gang of the Irish Burns brothers and the British police forces, with no heroic undertones, as opposed to the Ned Kelly and Bushranger films. And The Tracker focuses on the role as guide in a foreign land played by Aboriginal characters in Australian Westerns. And this is a very interesting film that reframes the Australian Western story from an indigenous point of view, subverting traditional Western representations of violence and replacing violent scenes with paintings made with earth from a wilderness sanctuary. Without getting into too many details, there are two features that I would like to mention that are important in these two films and in general in Australian Westerns. And they are the role of the outback or the bush and the role of Aborigines. The outback or the bush replaces the role of the landscape in the American West, but it presents, instead of presenting the outback as a site of national birth and cohesive identity, they present it, they say, as a heart of darkness or as a very dangerous place. Because in fact, the outback or the bush has never really been settled in the same way that the American West has been settled. So as a result, it has been called a heart of darkness. And there are people who have written, like Hamilton, about an eerie quality in Australian cinema in general. The landscape, the outback, the bush always has this very strange quality. If you have seen Picnic at Hanging Rock, you may know what I'm talking about. And it's always a dangerous place. And there you have another quote by Cook, who says that in Australian cinema, someone riding off into the sunset, especially into the desert, and especially a white fellow, is probably going to die. Okay? And this is actually what happens in The Tracker. In The Tracker, the other film that I was talking about, that's exactly the ending of that film. So this is also related to the role of Aborigines, which is also different from the role of Native Americans in American Westerns, because ever since the beginning, you know, in the Bushranger films and then in most of the hybrid films, Kangaroo films, the Aborigines were absent. Okay, they were part of the landscape, or some people have said, like even the fauna. Okay, this started to change in the 70s when there were a few films like Mad Dog Morgan, where they reclaimed, okay, the role of Aborigines, and this is the same thing that happens in The Tracker. And you have David Gulpilil, that's that actor there, who played the role of Black Tracker, and that made him the cinematic face of proud Aboriginality. We could also mention some post-westerns, okay, taking place in Australia, like Mystery Road, The Rover, or Goldstone, but I don't have time for that. Okay, so I'm going to leave this for some other time. Okay, so I will go now to Argentina so that we can compare these two different examples. So in Argentina, we also find an example of settler colonial cinema, and these are Gaucho films. Okay, so and there are several interesting differences because also the histories were different, and the way the countries were colonized share a few facts, but there are other differences. Anyway, Gauchos are Gaucho films come from the fact that you have these characters, these horsemen and cowboys from the southern cone of South America, the Gauchos, who they exist or existed not only in Argentina but also in Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Chile. And they have a very clearly identifiable dress code, as you can see there, the ponchos, the hats, the very peculiar pants, and some specific weapons, like the boleadoras, these balls that they use to hunt and to fight, and a facon, a large knife. And they used to be ranch workers in the Pampas, but they were also associated with national identity. This is something that is, I think, important. Okay, they were associated to Argentinian character independence ever since the Gaucho Wars. These were wars of independence against the Spanish Empire between 1814 and 1825. So they have always been associated with the national character. They're supposed to be brave, honest, silent, independent, rebellious, and violent. So you can see several features that sound a bit like cowboys, right? And ever from the beginning, they were also, they had a representation that was not filmic but literary. Okay, so right at the time that they were fighting the wars of independence, okay, there was already some poetry, Gaucho poetry, being written. In 1820, Bartolomé Hidalgo started writing. And then the most important poem in Argentinian history, I would say, the foundational poem of national identity was written. Okay, this is the Martín Fierro. Was written in two parts in 1872 and 1879. And this became the national epic poem, okay, telling the story of Martín Fierro, this gaucho, okay, who fights with the army and then is expelled, and then he gets away from the army. One of the features of the Martín Fierro and of Gaucho poetry in general is the colonial language. You have it in Spanish there. Mi gloria es vivir tan libre como el pájaro del cielo. No hago nido en este suelo ande hay tanto que sufrir. Y naides me ha de seguir cuando yo remonte el vuelo. You see how it sounds, and it uses very colloquial language, which is one of the important features here. What it says is, it is my glory to live as free as a bird in the sky. I make no nest on this ground where there is so much to be suffered, and no one follows me when I take to flight again. Okay? So, after Gaucho poetry, there are also Gaucho novels, and there you have the titles, Juan Morera, La Guerra Gaucha, Don Segundo Sombra. In all of them, you see the Gaucho as a rebel who rejects the social order and identifies with nature and the frontier, oscillating between the good and bad Gaucho, called also the matrero, who has been forced by society to become a rebel. These are not the only examples. Borges, Jorge Luis Borges, has used the Gaucho myth and has written stories about the Gaucho, and it's a common topic that you can find in Argentinian literature. But of course, with this tradition, when film arrived, you have Gaucho Films, and most of them are the adaptations of these literary works that I mentioned before. And they were developed independently from American Westerns. Okay, so this is, this settler colonial mode of cinema appeared also independently from American Westerns, and they were based on the stereotype established by the literary sources. When sound arrived, you also have these sound films. Some of them share the title because they are, again, adaptations and adaptations. So they develop, these sound films developed an independent discourse about national character and independence, as opposed to the Australian character, where this mature phase didn't happen. Again, here you do have this discourse with heavy literary influence and this colloquial national language. Okay, but then the Western was very strong. Okay, and as you know, it was shown all over the world, and as a result, we find hybrid films. Okay, so we have Gaucho films that use conventions from the Western, and there are all sorts of combinations. And here you have a few films like Pampa Barbara. For example, so these would be Gaucho Westerns, or we could maybe call them Asado Westerns, or Tango Westerns, or whatever. Okay, let's stick to Gaucho Westerns now. Okay, so Pampa Barbara, for example, poses the problem of the lack of women on the frontier. So this might remind some of you of Westward the Women, a film by William Wellman. But this was made several years before. Okay, so in this film, the soldiers desert and go with the Indians who have women for them. Okay, so that's a real problem. So they have to bring women from Buenos Aires. Okay, so this is the story. And you have, we don't have too much time, so I'm not going to show you. But if you see, I mean, these films are very easy to find. They're all on YouTube. And when you see the Indian attack scenes, for example, they look just like an American Western. But then all of a sudden you see a guy with the boleadoras, and you see, oh, all right, okay, so we're in Argentina. Okay, and there's this combination, like all of a sudden you see the landscape and it looks different, okay, because it's not, like it's the Argentina, or you see even the animals, or there are clues that tell you that you are there, okay. Pampas Salvajes, or Savage Pampas, is also interesting from a transnational point of view, because this is a film that was a remake of the first film, and it was a Spanish, American, and Argentinian co-production very influenced by spaghetti westerns. This is another film that some of you may have seen or may have known about, because this is an American film. Okay, so Way of a Gaucho is a Hollywood production, directed by Jacques Tourneur with Gene Tierney and Rory Cullen, and this would be the equivalent of the Kangaroo story films that we mentioned before. Actually, one of them was made exactly the same year, 1952. And it also had to do with the intricacies of American film production, because the studios had some money that had been frozen in other countries, and they needed to use, in order to use that money, they had to make films in those countries. Okay, so they said, okay, why not making an Argentinian Western? Okay, and they made Way of a Gaucho, which is a very interesting combination. Again, clearly you have some scenes where you have like the Indian attack again, and then you see the boleadoras, and then there are other clues that tell you that we're in Australia. Okay, and then following this same story, we find revisionist films. Okay, and these are also hybrid Gaucho Western films. Okay, and here you have two examples. Juan Morera, you may remember the name because we have shown it before. Okay, this is based on the real case of a social bandit, and then they wrote the novel, they made the silent film, they made a couple of sound films, and then they made this in 1973. But it's more, it's influenced by spaghetti westerns, and it criticizes the hero, this Juan Morera guy. Amaya was made in 2010. It's also a very interesting film. Okay, and this tells the story. This is obviously inspired by westerns. It starts with an attack by some outlaws to a stagecoach, and at first it looks just like an American western, and then of course you see Argentinian stuff all of a sudden. This is the story of a repented bad gaucho who, inspired by stylites, these stylites are some ascetic pillar saints who climb a pillar and never get off it. Okay, but you have heard of them, but this guy had heard of that, and he decides never to get off his horse as a form of penance. Okay, so this is Amaya, and he waits for revenge from his victim's son, who he had allowed to live. Okay, at the beginning of the story. Anyway, so it's an interesting story, and it's based on a short story by Antonio Di Benedetto, who's an interesting writer, and it's graphically violent, inspired by and influenced by Peckinpah and Leone. And let me mention, just to finish, two more revisionist Argentinian Western films. These are sort of art house films. They have different connections between them, because both of them are art house, a bit strange. They're pretty good, very interesting, I think. The first one is made in French and Spanish, and the second one is made in Danish and Spanish. Jauja, okay, that's the second one. They're both related to Borges, but the first one is an adaptation of a short story by Borges, and the second one reflects the kind of fantastic atmosphere that you can find in some Borges stories. They both have a political intention because they deal with national identity. They are a critique of the story of the conquest of the South. Okay, and we don't have any gauchos here. These are more like cavalry kind of stories. Okay, where the protagonists are military men, and both of them are related to the searchers quite clearly, because in both of them you have a girl who is kidnapped. In Warriors and Captives, they try to civilize this girl that had been made captive by the Indians, and then they take her back. So it's a searcher story again and again. And in Jauja, the character, the main protagonist, who is Viggo Mortensen, as you can see there, his daughter is also taken captive, and he has to go after her. So both of them very interesting. I think there are also post-westerns that we could talk about, like Un lugar en el mundo, A place in the world, which is a film which is, I think, quite clearly inspired by Shane, but then it's a story set outside Buenos Aires after the military dictatorship. So this is a Spanish-Argentinian film, which is also very interesting. So just to sum up, I think that we have found evidence of the existence of something like we could call a global settler mode of cinema. So we need to consider, of course, I'm not going to deny the Americanness of American Westerns, but we also need to consider them as parallel examples of other films that have been made, as we have seen in Australia and Argentina. I think in Brazil and New Zealand we can also find similar examples. So these are also countries that have had a similar film history. I think I always find it fascinating why these stories are also used to develop a discourse on national identity, Westerns or post-Westerns. We have seen the differences, how in some, like in the Argentinian case, there is a more importance of the literary examples and how the situation of Australia and its connection with the United States explains why there was no mature phase to develop this. But I think this is interesting to at least make us think about these examples from a transnational point of view. That's all. Thank you very much.
So we have now about 10 minutes to questions, comments. One.
I thank you both for those magnificent papers. They're really very enlightening and inspiring. Thank you. I have a question that I think sort of both papers could address, or actually no, the writers could address. And it's, over the past few days, I've found myself in several conversations semi-joking about the fact that if you want to see what the U.S. West looks like, go to Canada, because prominent Clint Eastwood films, Kevin Costner films, they all, even Terrence Malick took Days of Heaven up to the Canadian Rockies and to make the film that makes it look like the 19th century American West. But now we're seeing things like The Revenant go down to South America, or we're seeing Hour of the Dog, actually filmed in New Zealand. And then in your case of your paper, not only do we see the Hogans that looks very similar to the Navajos, but we also see the beehive houses that are familiar to ancient Ireland, and the baobab trees, not just the agave, but also the baobab trees from Madagascar. And so there's this way in which both of these papers seem to be also alluding to the fact that perhaps there's a shift in mainstream representations of the West that now starts to look a little different from what we've come to expect. It's not just Monument Valley, but it's places like New Zealand and South America. I don't remember where The Revenant exactly was filmed, but maybe just talk a little bit about some of these visual elements of the West that are evolving before our very eyes.
Well, in the case of Raised by Wolves, it was actually filmed, interestingly, in South Africa. And I know. The point, I think, it's because there are so many elements that you recognize, but then they become defamiliarized precisely because the whole point is to create a new planet. So it's like this idea of the unheimlich. It's familiar, but it's not. I recognize it, and yet it's something else. And this otherness, of course, also plays into this idea that they are working with different versions of being people. Also, I think that the first homestead with the mother and father and the children, it's clearly westernized, but from the perspective of the classic Mexican peasants, obviously trodden by the gringos, and so this kind of trope. So I think it's interesting. It's a very interesting point. It's trying to create a different myth that is emerging from all of these composite images from the original myths. So yeah, very, very interesting. Good point.
I'm thinking that this also has to do with globalization, you know, and the fact that it's probably related also to production features, you know. I mean, there may be production reasons why they choose to go here or there. They choose South Africa or they choose money. So, but on the other hand, you know, it's true that I mean we were on this road to increasing globalization and all the myths, all the conventions, all the we're all sharing so many things that there are more and more exchanges. So I think this helps also understand all of this.
I was thinking of, just as a suggestion, maybe you can explain a little bit. What about the cangaceiros of Brazil that they are sort of, right? I mean, would fit into this, into your scheme, okay?
I need to increase my research on Brazil. I mean, the good thing that, as you know, the good thing about having chosen this transnational perspective is that it helps me travel physically or virtually. So I've seen a few films, you know, the Cangaceiro films, Antonio das Mortes, and but I still need to, and there are a few articles that have been published about them. I think it's different from what I have read because there is not so much, there is not such a strong presence of something like Gaucho culture, okay, in this, and these Cangaceiro films are more like outlaw films, but you also have these art house films like Antonio das Mortes, so I think it's also an example in they call them the Northeastern, okay, so I think it would be the same thing, so it's another example of this settler colonial cinema, but with specific features there. Yeah. Yeah, very specific, I know. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the basis for some of those movies is literary and it's Brazilian. And but there's a definite connection between the cangaceiro or the sertanejo from Sertão with the American cowboy. And one of my students has written his dissertation on that. So you could, if you want.
Yeah, I'm ready to move on.
Other questions? I just have one for Amaya. I think I have read on one of your screenshots a name, Lamia. Lamia, okay, Lamia happens to be a character of the Basque mythology, and I don't. Okay.
Sorry. And also in ancient Greek mythology.
Is it I mean, is it human? Is it?
No, she's an android. She's a necromancer, and so she's an android that originally was just, you know, service model, but then it was reconfigured and reprogrammed to fight in this war. She fought for the atheist side. So interesting in this inversion, the physical posture, it's she posits as a Christ. And the word Lamia, of course, this witch / monster / magical creature that's very much feminine, is also subverting the whole idea of the Christ being the son of God. So in this case, she is the daughter of this human engineer, and you see how complex the whole idea is of, you know, just who is what, and so I think it was definitely deliberate choice.
You said, I don't know, Raised by Wolves at all, but you said it been cancelled, right?
It has.
Which sort of led me to two thoughts. And, perhaps you know why it was cancelled. I presume it's financial, but you can tell me that.
Yeah.
But also it reminded me of what happened to Firefly, which is
Oh.
another example of a kind of similar feel to what you were describing, which is one of my favourites. And you know, it seemed to be relatively well liked and critically acclaimed, and yet the studios pulled the plug on it. So I don't know whether you see a connection between those and any similarities in why they were cancelled.
I think, as far as Raised by Wolves is concerned, it had to do with the fact that HBO has been bought recently, or there's been some sort of merging of two different companies, and they had to, from financial reason, they simply had to decide where to cut. And I think this is, I think when you have series that are too complex philosophically speaking, too deep, and that are really not easy to follow, you cannot just comfortably doze off while you watch them. They are, I think, the first to go, because they are more niche, simply. And I think that's the only reason. I could, as far as I've read, I've tried to find another reason, but I think that's the only one that's been out there. They've tried to find alternative financial sources, even resorting to, appeals to the public. Please use the hashtag "Don't cancel Raised by Wolves," but I think it's to no avail. So.
Any other question, comments? No. So I think we can leave it here, but as Jesús, Ángel, and as Amaya previously said, we have a film on the Florida Cinema Theater at San Prudencio Street at 7:30. So I hope Jesús, Ángel, and with the following, with the conversation following the film.
Film, I think Amaya mentioned, the film is shown in English with Spanish subtitles, but then the conversation, the debate is all in Spanish. Okay, it's part of an activity organized by a film club. Okay, and so we're working with them. But anyway, if anybody's interested, they'll be there.